So population as a driver of food consumption is going to slow considerably. I'm going to show a sequence of slides as I talk through these. And Aares and I have put together a very simple numerical implementation of that very simple theoretical model. The demand side is built up from the country level. Obviously, it matters what countries are experiencing the population growth, and what countries are experiencing the income growth, because their consumption patterns differ. The main point out of this figure, which takes 2007 as the 100 point, is that the last 15 years of population growth added an absolute increment of plus 19. That's 19% of 2000 level food consumption. The last 15 years in this horizon I'm looking at will only add half of that, or plus 9. So population growth as a driver of food consumption is slowing. No surprises there, but it's important to fix that in our minds. Income growth then becomes more important. This is a lovely graphic of how diets tend to evolve as living standards rise, going from the bottom of the trapezoid to the top. The quantity of food consumed at the bottom, and if we put that in land terms, it would be even a steeper rise. But as people become richer, as we know, they consume more livestock products. Among other things, livestock requires a lot more land to produce a given amount of calories, for example. So essentially, we're moving the income growth as it moves up this inverted pyramid. It has the potential to contribute quite a bit to demand. How much? Well, again, we put it through this little model, and in this case, we're just taking a fixed composition over these 15-year periods and asking how much of the growth over that 15-year period is coming from population, how much from per capita income, and you can see that more and more will be coming from per capita income growth at the end of this period. So as a driver of change, we need to be paying more attention to income, and population will become less important. So that's pretty well understood. I just wanted to get that out there so it was fixed in your mind. An area that's received kind of less attention in aggregate and perhaps less careful thought is that of biofuels. Biofuels as a driver of demand for agricultural output. It's not surprising that we've gotten pretty excited about that recently because by Pat Westhoff's calculations, over a 2-year period in the last decade, half of the global increase in cereals consumption came from U.S. ethanol production alone. So low base, high rate of growth can, in hundreds of percents, can give rise to a large increment because food consumption is growing relatively slowly. FAO OECD project maize and oilseeds continued large share of global growth coming from biofuel demand. Obviously, this depends on government policies and market conditions. I'm going to say more about that. Well, by the way, in the lower right-hand corner, I'm trying, for those who are mathematically oriented, these are either the shocks or the parameters that I'm kind of thinking about when I'm talking about this slide. So this relates to both final demand growth and you'll see, very importantly, to the price elasticity of demand. These are YASA projections of biofuel demand just based on targets. From a couple of years ago, this was a 2009 FAO conference. Gunter Fischer put this together. But you can see, if you believe what countries said they're going to do, it's big. We put it into our little numerical framework, and you can see that it doesn't dominate population, but it becomes important out there as a driver of growth. Particularly in that last, in the outline periods. So I want to say a little more about biofuels, maybe just because it's a bit of a personal issue. I got embroiled in the California regulation, and boy, there was a lot of heat generated around that discussion. I just want to make a point that this very simple framework I've laid out shed some insight that has been ignored by many people talking about those impacts. So the U.S. ethanol program, for example, was built on the expectation of very significant greenhouse gas reductions by blending ethanol with gasoline or even going with pure, largely high ethanol percentage vehicles. A bit of a damper thrown on that when people started figuring what the land use requirements were and that this might generate land conversion, thereby generating additional greenhouse gas emissions. This was known as the indirect land use change argument, ILUC, and there are conferences going on and publications and journals and books around this topic. But I think this one expression pretty much tells what we need to know, and that is, if you want to know how much land is going to be required for these biofuels, the delta, okay, you need to understand the economic response. And the economic response is going to greatly moderate these effects, although not eliminate them. I've been asked whether I believe in land use change. I mean, it's not a religious question for me. It's an economic question. But the fact is you need to understand these elasticities in order to do this. So the intensive margin, biofuels bid up prices and land values, as they've done in the U.S. How much do yields respond? And boy, it's been amazing to see the excitement in the research establishment, people getting involved in maize R&D that had never thought about agriculture before, just because it's generated high prices and media attention's generated a lot of interest. There's a lot of potential there, I think, on that intensive margin, but it has to be evaluated relative to the extensive margin. Demand has been largely ignored in this. So I'm not saying reductions in consumption in poor countries are a good thing, but it is something that we observe. And we observe, according to international cross-section estimates of price elasticity of demand done by James Seal and others, very large price elasticity of demand for food in the poorest countries. So fairly significant potential on the consumption side as well for response. Lower as countries become richer. So if you envision going out to 2050, when many more countries are at the U.S. Income level, this price elasticity demand is going to be smaller. The land required for a given perturbation is going to be larger. So again, we just put it in this simple framework, put some numbers on this. Think about the YASA projections of biofuel growth over the next, from 2007 to 2052, so 45 years. We're going in 15-year increments, mainly because we calibrated this model to the 15-year history. So we kind of go in 15-year steps. To meet that, we would need, relative to 2007 levels, we'd need 9% more cropland area if there were no response. But in fact, there is likely to be significant response in the intensive margin, also in the demand margin. So the full economic response, that is the solution of the model with economics embedded in it, much smaller land use change. Nonetheless, by our calculations for U.S. corn ethanol, it's not generating significant emissions reductions, and the land use change is enough to offset any gains over gasoline and direct emissions. But I think you've got to think about it in this context, and most of the stuff written on that doesn't take those margins into account. So the interesting thing about biofuels that is often overlooked, I think it's been largely overlooked, is its effect on this price elasticity of demand, the farm level price elasticity of demand for agricultural products. If you think about the size of the liquid fuels market globally, and you think about the amount of biofuels being put into that right now, it's a drop in the bucket. As the CAST report, Buchanan, Hurt, and Tweeten wrote, there's nearly unlimited demand for the biofuels if the price is right, and you don't choke off supplies by raising the feedstock prices. Of course, that's what happens, is more demand, more supply, raises the feedstock price, cuts off biofuels as a viable option. But fundamentally, this is going to depend on the price of oil, is my view. I mean, there are mandates out there, but those mandates are being challenged increasingly for environmental purposes. There are subsidies out there, but governments are more and more budget constrained. Those are going to fall under the axe eventually. It's going to be all about oil prices. What do we know about oil prices? Could be high, could be low, okay? This is the EIA projections for last year, and you can see it's low price to high price. It's really hard to tell. But if you just took the reference scenario, according to work done at Missouri with the Fabry model, you could get nearly half of the U.S. corn production going to ethanol. So at those oil prices, could make so it's all about the oil prices here and the policies to some degree, and those are things that we haven't thought about in the past. In fact, if you look at the correlation between energy prices and, say, maize prices in the US, very small up until recently. Now that correlation depends entirely on whether the policies are binding or not. So that switches on and off. End of the year, they may be, mandate may be binding, or, and from time to time, also the blend wall has been binding. Our analysis of that is that if you get into so you have the one situation where government policies are irrelevant, you're at high oil prices, lots of this product is going into the market, disruption to the supply side in agriculture, you can pull some of that back, no problem. Shut down a few ethanol plants. Creates much more elasticity in the system, much more ability to adjust to supply side shocks. On the other hand, if we're in the low oil price situation with the mandates binding, you've got essentially zero elasticities in the US, where ethanol is a volumetric target. And you can exacerbate, so a very small elasticity, you exacerbate the volatility to a supply side shock. We estimate that the increment to maize price volatility in the face of supply side shocks could rise by 50% if the US, both the mandate and the blend wall were binding at the same time. So very important for this buffer, this term in the denominator, biofuels will be very important in the future for that reason. Okay, so now we've got to work our way back from demand to, from the demand for the output to the derived demand for land. Derived demand for land is going to depend on what happens to yields, okay? So I'm not so much worried about the total factor productivity Phil was talking about. That's going to be important for prices, commodity prices. The derived demand for land depends fundamentally on what happens to yields. Okay. Output per hectare. FAO estimates that over the last 50 years, 77% of production growth has come from yields globally, and just 14% from area expansion. Can this be maintained? That's the key question. That is the question about the extensive margin. Unfortunately, these projections of yield growth are exogenous, and it's hard to know what's going on. And to reinforce a few of the points Phil made, wheat and rice, Byerly has thought about this a lot, and Fisher, Byerly, and their co-author identified 24 breadbasket regions where yield growth for those crops has fallen to less than 0.5% per year from very high levels in the 80s. You know, this could be due to an approaching some kind of yield maximum, or it could be due to economic forces. My view is these things are to a great degree endogenous in the long run. But let's explore the yield gap thing for a moment, and for this I'm going to exploit the Raman Cuddy data set. I've been collaborating with him for about 10 years and continue to be impressed at his ability to manipulate massive amounts of data. I'm going to focus on the Licker et al. Study that has used this global database on crop yields and harvested area. They broke the world into 100 zones, agroclimatic zones. In each zone, similar conditions, okay? But not spatially contiguous necessarily. So some of Victoria could be grouped with part of North America and part of Germany, part of somewhere in Africa. These are grouped together to identify, to have a common biophysical potential. Then they line up the yields in that zone from lowest to highest. They fix on the 90th percentile as a reasonable, given the noise in the data, given the kind of maximum yield potential with current technology. So this is purely a biophysical view of the world. What can be accomplished in that environment somewhere around the world with current technology? And they find that closing these yield gaps could really boost global production. And here's just a picture of the Licker et al. Yield gaps. And green means they're really close to the front, they're setting the frontier, and the red means they're way off of it. So not surprisingly, you see green in the Corn Belt for maize in the US, and red in Mozambique and Tanzania, for example, in East Africa. So, so that raises the question, why do these exact gaps exist? Could they be closed? What's involved in closing them? There's